Move into Chapter 8. We're looking at hypothesis testing. We're also getting into material that's fairly recent, so you should be remembering a lot of this. We just want to go through a problem and make sure that you remember the steps and how it works. I would encourage you on Chapter 8 to be sure that you have your chart handy that helps you with the conclusion. Okay, so you should see that on the screen right now. You might take a picture or write it, just pause right here and write it down so that you have that. Okay, and then also have both of your tables handy to work these problems. All right, so I'm just going to work probably one of these with you because they are kind of long. Remember that we do have the option for Z or T with the same criteria that we had back in Chapter 7. And so that is, remember that if you have the standard deviation of the population, you are using a Z-score, and if you have the standard deviation of the sample, you're using a T-score. The problem itself doesn't really work that differently. The Z or the T comes in step 2, where you're doing your critical values on your curve. Otherwise, the problem is exactly the same, Z or T. Okay, so let's just kind of look at this thing. I'm going to scan through. What I want to find is the part where it talks about standard deviation first. So I see that here, and it's very clear to me which one we're dealing with because it says that we have the standard deviation of the population. All right, so I know right now that this is going to be a Z-score problem. All right, so let's look at our hypotheses. Remember that we are looking for some kind of keyword like less or more or increase or decrease. All right, and in the absence of that, we would probably do an equal or not equal. So it says the Medical Rehabilitation Education Foundation reports that the average cost of rehabilitation for stroke victims is $24,672. To see if the average cost of rehabilitation is different at a particular hospital, a researcher selects a random sample of 35 stroke victims at the hospital and finds that the average cost of their rehabilitation is $25,226. At alpha is equal to 0.01, can it be concluded that the average cost of stroke rehabilitation at a particular hospital is different, and there we got that kind of keyword again, from $24,672. So nowhere in this problem do I see anything that makes me think that I would have a greater than or a less than in this problem. The best I can find for a keyword is different. All right, so I'm going to go ahead with an equal, not equal. Now remember, the null hypothesis is always equal anyway. All right, and so we're going to be different than 24,672. And I'm going to let the alternate hypothesis be not equal. Okay, again, because we don't see anything in the problem to indicate a greater than or less than. All right, so I'm going to go with the equal, not equal. All right, so remember that for step 2, you are going to shade based on what your hypotheses look like. And so if you have an equal, not equal to scenario, you're going to shade in both tails of the curve. All right, now remember, we've already decided it's Z-scores. So I'm going to go get my alpha value, which is 0.01, and I'm going to divide it into 2 because I have 2 sections that are shaded in my curve. And so each section of this is 0.005. Now my job is to find the Z-score that separates the shaded from not shaded. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract one of those 0.005s from 0.5, which will give me 4950. And so 4950 is going to be my area from 0 to the Z-score that I'm about to look up. All right, so I'm going to go to my table, table B-1 or table E, the first table that you were given. I'm going to look in the middle of that table for 4950. All right, and it actually falls halfway in between 2 of the numbers. Okay, it is between 4949 and 4951. And remember, if it's halfway in between, we go with the bigger one. If it's obviously closer to one or the other numbers, then you use the one it's closest to. But if it's right in the middle, you go with the larger one. So we're going to be doing 4951, which is going to be 2.58. All right, so we're going to have a negative 2.58 over here. And we're going to have a positive 2.58 over here. And that will take care of step 2 for us. Okay, so step 3 is to calculate your test value. So this is where you're going to take your information and plug it into the z-score formula. So we know that when he selected his random sample of 35 stroke victims at the hospital, he found the average to be 25,226. And so that number goes first. The number in the hypotheses goes second, so 24,672. We're going to divide by our standard deviation, which they told me was 3251. And then divide by the square root of the sample size. So he selected a sample of 35. All right, so now I'm going to go to my calculator with that. I'm going to put a parenthesis around the top and the bottom. All right, so I'm going to get 1.01 for my z-score. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my curve and I'm going to mark that off and see what I'm going to do with the null hypothesis. All right, so 1.01 is going to sit like right in here somewhere, pretty close to 0 actually. And remember that we are comparing back to 0. All right, so let's see, A, B, this is the third step. Okay, so the fourth step, we're going to say reject or do not reject. Remember that the null says that those two red marks are equal. We're saying, yeah, basically the same. So we're going to do not reject the null. And then we're going to go back to that little chart that I showed you just a minute ago, and we are going to find our conclusion. So I do need to go back and do the claim. I forgot that for part A. We are trying to conclude, and I'm looking at the last sentence, we are trying to conclude that the average is different. All right, so different would put the claim as the H1. Okay, so I know that the claim is H1, and we said do not reject. So I'm going to go back to my chart. All right, claim is H1, that's here. We said do not reject. Okay, so here's my statement right here that I would want to write down. There's not enough evidence to support the claim. And that will be my conclusion. Okay, so again, I'm not going to do another problem, but what I want you to just be mindful of is that when you're choosing Z or T, the only place that makes a difference is here in this step right here. Okay, so we did it for Z. If you had happened to have done a T value, then you would just go to the other table and look up those values. So I would suggest that you practice both of those scenarios, a Z-score and a T-score, so that you have both of those done. I would also suggest, and again, I'm not going to work a separate problem, but I would also suggest that you look at something where they give you the data and be sure that you are remembering how to use your calculator to calculate the mean, okay? Because you might have a situation like that where they don't give you the sample mean and you have to calculate it yourself. All right, so that does a quick review on Chapter 8.